I'm Jo Wright, and this is the Coaching Culture Podcast, where we discuss how to make work better. Hello and welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast. My name's Jo Wright, and today I have got a fabulous guest, Andy Lopata. Now, Andy is a 5-times author. He writes for Psychology Today, which is hugely impressive, and speaks on this very topic all around the world. And the topic is professional relationships, vulnerability and authenticity. So Andy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Jo. Great to be on it. Great to see you again as well.
I know. Why did I invite you on this podcast? Because I saw you speak in London, and I was the person sat probably quite at the front, nodding my head off, so engaged with what you were saying, because everything you were saying to me really resonated. You had such a way, you were very engaging, but you were talking about the importance and the power of professional relationships, which can really help you in your life and your career. So that's why I'm here today asking you questions, because obviously we're here at Coaching Culture, and building a coaching culture is all about the power of relationships, power of building rapport and trust. But before we dive into the nitty-gritty of that topic, I'd love you to share with our listeners a little bit more about your most recent book that I know you showed me before the podcast is now in Chinese, so even more impressive. So tell us a little bit more about Just Ask.
Yes, so I wrote Just Ask. It was a labour of love that took several years, actually. And it goes back to, I would say, probably about 2014. And my business was really struggling. And I'm a member of the Professional Speaking Association. And you may well have listeners who are members of the PSA as well. Yeah. And we call our community our tribe. Yeah, we're very close to each other there. And if it was around 2014, I would have been a member for 11 years by that stage. I joined in 2003. And I was going to PSA meetings. And in the networking at the beginning of the events, everyone asked the same question: how's business? And we all answer the same way. Yeah, it's great.
Fine. Yeah.
And there was one particular meeting in Reading where we had a workshop before the main presentations, before the main meeting. And the facilitator, a guy called Stephen Houghton Burnett, gave out questionnaires for us to quietly fill in before he started the session. And there were two very similar questions in there, multiple choice. And they were, how would you describe your business at the moment? The two questions were, how would you describe your speaking business, and how would you describe your non-speaking business? Because obviously some people speak as part of what they do. And there were 4 choices. They were growing, stable, new, or in decline. And everyone filled these questions out quietly, probably about 10 or 12 questions in total. And then Steve started the workshop, and he went through the questions, and he just asked for a show of hands for responses. And when it came to those 2 questions, people put their hands up for growing, people put their hands up for stable, people put their hands up for new. But on neither question did anyone put their hand up for in decline. There were liars in that room. You know, I know there were liars in that room because I was lying. My business was really struggling at the time. We were in a really bad place. I think we got to within £400 of our overdraft limit at some point on that journey. And that was the moment where it sort of really was driven home to me what I'd been doing. You know, I'd been in this community we call a tribe. I'd been talking to people who I was friends with, people who in the same business, same industry, who understood the challenges of it. And when they asked how business was, I said it was great when it wasn't. And I realized that by doing that, I was not asking for the help that I needed to get out of the rut I was in. And I made a commitment to myself at that stage that I would turn the business around with other people's help. I would change the way I answered that question. And then when I had I'd experienced the success I needed, because everyone wants a happy ending, I would speak at the PSA annual convention and encourage our community to be more vulnerable. And that's exactly what happened. Turned the business around, got support from people. 2016, I spoke main stage at the PSA National Convention. I've delivered the same talk at the Asian Professional Speakers Asian Professional Speakers Singapore, the Asian Convention, South Africa, New Zealand, India, Australia, for a lot of international associations. And this year I'm speaking at the Global Speakers Summit on vulnerable leadership, so I'm taking that topic further forward. And the response to that first talk led to the book. I realized that this was a lot stronger than I'd even thought, and more prevalent. And the best way to learn about a topic is to write a book. And I interview people from all over the world about vulnerability, cultural differences, gender differences, generational differences. Got stories from a former Bronx gang member, from I'm trying to think who else I've got in the book now. There's so many stories in there. Someone who was homeless for 2 years in the US. A whole range of amazing stories. Tom Petty and Leonard Cohen's former backing singer.
So, Andy, it sounds like vulnerability is something that is obviously bubbling up to the surface a lot more, and people are recognising the power of vulnerability. We've written a lot about vulnerable leadership and empathetic leadership and authentic leadership in our Coaching Culture magazine, and it really does resonate. However, some people really struggle with it. Some people really struggle. They come to work with their work mask on. They leave the house, a loving, caring, nurturing person, parent, whatever. And then they come to work and they change because they feel that, something needs to be different. And I don't know whether people think that a professional mask isn't a vulnerable mask, whereas I totally disagree with that. I think you can be both, and harnessing the power of vulnerability is really important. So what have you experienced along the way in your journey to explore vulnerability and asking others for help?
Well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. We all do go around wearing a mask. That's often been the core of my talk on the topic of asking for help, is discarding the mask or knowing when to. And I think it's important to stress that there are times when you do need to wear a mask, and they do serve a purpose. And so sometimes it might be, let's put it this way. If you're a financial advisor with money worries, you don't share those with your clients necessarily. You focus on what you can deliver for them. And similarly, no one wants their coach to sit down and talk about their personal life and their issues with them. Yeah. Their focus has to be on their client. And just because you're struggling with certain things doesn't make you a bad coach. There are techniques to help you coach effectively, and you're in the room for your client. And actually, if you're going through your own stuff, then perhaps that gives you a better empathy and understanding of others. So I think that it's important to stress we're not talking about discarding the mask. There was a Harvard Business School study in, I think it was 2019. I came across it before it was officially published, because I talk about it in Just Ask, where they ran a series of experiments, and the last one, they were all towards the same end, obviously, but the last one was a Dragon's Den style pitching competition. And in one stream, if you like, the person would pitch their business talking about how wonderful it was and their great results and their great success. In the contra stream, they would share the same successes, the same results, but they would share their stumbles along the way, the challenges they'd faced. And they measured what they called malicious envy and benign envy. So malicious envy is, I want you to fail. Benign envy is, I want to be like you. And they found that when people only shared successes, and this was just the last part of the study, but the results correlated across the whole study. When people only shared successes, there were high levels of malicious envy. When people shared successes but included their stumbles along the way, there were higher levels of benign envy. In other words, if we step down off our pedestal and show that we're not perfect, then people engage and relate to us better. And my own personal experience of that, and there have been many, but the first one I really noticed was a talk I gave many years ago at a branch of Barclays Bank. For any fans of the history of London, it's the Whitechapel branch, which is opposite the Blind Beggar pub, which is famous in the Cray twins story. And it was a small talk, for a group of local business customers for Barclays. And it was a talk that I had delivered many times, and I delivered many times. And the thing about my talks is I have stuff that I always share. I have a structure, but the stories might change because it might depend on what's happened in the last week. It might depend what comes to mind in that moment or a conversation I had just before. And the 3 stories I shared in that talk were by accident, not by design. They all involved me falling and learning something. And the response to that talk was way off the scale. It was just the way, the enthusiasm of people, the amount of people that came up and wanted to talk to me afterwards, everything felt so much more amped up than normal. Yeah. And when I reflected on it, the difference I noticed was that all of my stories took me off my pedestal. And so I think that that's a really good example. We want, you said at the beginning, that I write for psychologytoday.com and that's impressive in itself. And it's very easy to create a CV where people go, wow, and they almost feel they can't approach you. And particularly when you speak internationally and you come in as the star of the show, it's quite a strange experience. And I think it's important not to let that go to your head and to recognize that everyone is fallible and everyone is human and everyone has strengths and everyone has weaknesses. And that's part of what makes us special and relatable. So that's key. One of the stories I share, and it's not so much about vulnerability in the sense of opening up to mistakes, but it's more vulnerability and authenticity in terms of being yourself. I share a story in one of my talks about my mentor, and he was a client of mine, and I delivered what must be the biggest road crash of a program for him and his team. And in fact, I probably told this story at the talk you came to.
You did, I remember.
Yeah. And it was a private equity team. And the program was an absolute car crash, complete disaster. And 3 years later, we were sitting over lunch together. We'd stayed in touch. And he said to me, why don't we work with you anymore? And I said, are you serious? Do you not remember what happened? And he went, oh, yes, you're right. But why? And we had the debrief we should have had 3 years previously, to be honest.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, he brought me back in to work with his team because we identified what the issues were. They weren't all on my side. And we identified what needed to be different. And he brought me back in to work with his team. And subsequently, he's referred me. I've just been delivering a program for a company of which he's a chairman. And he's my mentor now as well. And the point of the story that I share is how, where I've delivered my worst ever program, I've built such a strong professional relationship with him. And if you remember, I shared 2 photos. So the initial photo...
You did. I've just seen them in my mind. You had a very suited and booted one, and then you had an absolute crazy one in a football shirt, I think it was. Was it? So, and did he have a wig as well?
He had a claret and blue bubble perm. And the story was that when we first met, it was at an executive leadership team retreat for the bank he was a senior leader of. And we sat together over dinner after my talk. We talked about the work, but we also talked about football. And he invited me to Wembley for a match a couple of weeks later. He's an Aston Villa fan. They were one of the teams involved. And he said, meet us on the Chinese restaurant on Wembley Estate at 2:00. And I went looking for the suited and booted investment banker. And I found the guy in the Aston Villa shirt and the claret and blue bubble perm. And the whole point is, you connect on a human level, not based on what it says on your business card. So going back to your original question, that authenticity, and I think that this is where vulnerability and authenticity tie together, because they are very closely related. When we hear the term vulnerability, we often think about, similar to the story I shared earlier, being open when things are going wrong. But actually being vulnerable can just mean being yourself. And I think that that's where they intertwine.
Yeah. And I think, they're such important topics, and I don't know I think it's been spoken about a lot more thanks to people like yourself, really bringing such a huge topic to the fore. And we talk here about a coaching culture being a place where authentic leaders help people to grow, thrive and perform. And it's absolutely about that. Being real, being relatable, being human, being yourself. And I think when people are truly their selves, others can relate to them. They realize they're not superhuman. They haven't got a cape that they bring to work every day with a big S on the back or anything like that. But it is not easy. Are you finding, how do people open up to you and say, actually, I find that really difficult. I don't want, I want to bring my corporate suit. I don't want to bring my bubble perm to work. How do people break down those barriers in their own head?
I think the first thing as a coach, I'm not a coach, but I do mentor.
Yeah.
So similar space, slightly different approach.
Yeah, totally.
But same challenges, I would argue. I don't try and force anything on anyone. I share suggestions and advice and observations.
Yeah.
And I work a lot in corporate. I do LinkedIn training for a couple of large organizations where I'm working with a lot of engineers. And when they're sharing on LinkedIn, if they're sharing on LinkedIn, they're just reposting the marketing spiel from the company.
Totally.
And I express the power and the benefits of being yourself on LinkedIn. But there's always pushback, always. And I simply say, my job is to open your eyes to another possibility, and you weigh up the pros and cons for yourself and take baby steps if you need to. But people need to go at their own pace. I'll look for examples that will resonate with them, that come from the same space, preferably from their bosses. If I can show their bosses doing it, then it's still, they're not going to have a hallelujah moment and change straight away, but they might dip their toe in the water with a little bit more courage. So I think going at people's pace is key. Understanding what stops people from opening up and sharing is important as well. I talk in Just Ask, and I talk in a lot of my talks about the 3 reasons we don't ask for help. And I think it's understanding those. So I think we don't ask for help because we don't want to be a burden to other people. That's a very common one. And yet when I ask audiences how they feel when they've helped other people, they've got pleasure from it.
I love it. Yeah.
Point out that disconnect and say, are you actually being a bit selfish and denying other people the pleasure of helping you? We don't ask for help because we don't want to look vulnerable. And we've talked a lot about vulnerability without talking about vulnerability as a strength, not a weakness, and how that's a misconception. And it takes courage to ask. It takes strength to ask. And by asking, we become stronger if we get the resolution and the support we're looking for. You can look weak asking for help, but that's just how you frame the question. So help people frame it better. Frame from a position of strength. If I say to you, Joe, Just Ask has been a finalist in the Business Book Awards and has been getting a great response everywhere it's been, but I'm not happy with how many I've sold. Could you help me? I don't think that sounds like weakness. I think that comes from a position of strength.
Definitely.
So it can be how you frame it. And then the third is that we assume. We assume people don't want to help us. We assume people can't help us. That's not our job. Let them decide. But be okay with a no. Communicate to them it's okay to say no, and communicate it to yourself, because our ego gets in the way and we take in no as rejection. When actually, if you're asking the right people in the right way that makes it easy for them, if they say no and the relationship is strong, then there are other reasons. And it may be their own imposter syndrome. It may be their own capacity to help, but we take it personally and we need to get beyond that. So I think if we understand that, then we can address those issues. If you put yourself in that coaching environment, if you understand what stops people from being more vulnerable, what stops people from being more themselves, whatever it might be, whether it's in being authentic, I think there will be similar issues, particularly the vulnerability and what other people think, that type of driver. So if you understand that, that can make a big difference as well.
And I think the space that we operate in here at Coaching Culture is often about how we can get leaders and managers. We say we exist to make work better. So to get leaders and managers really thinking differently about the way they lead and manage. So using more of a coaching style more of the time, which does include being authentic self, but allowing your team to be authentically themselves, being vulnerable, being humble, showing you're a human being, not the boss is kind of the old school idea of leadership, and actually bringing your true self to work, whatever you may want to bring. So that's your choice. Again, it's whoever you want to be, I think is so important. And I know that, all the work we look at, the research we do about, building trust and psychological safety is huge. But a massive part of that is about, at the very top of that sort of rapport triangle, showing your true human self and sharing more things about yourself, which is increasing risk, but increases trust, builds a relationship. So it's all in this space, isn't it? And I definitely think, in a good way, times are changing, and I think the pandemic has accelerated it to another level. It was already happening, but it's accelerated. So I think this is a hugely important space to talk about more, to say it's okay to be yourself. It's okay to tell people you've made a mistake. It's okay to, I think of a talk I did recently where I kind of took the mickey out myself in the storytelling, and people were laughing. And it was like the bit that got the most interaction. I was doing all the sort of typical stuff, but the minute I totally talked about my mess ups throughout my career, they loved it. Because I was going.
Experiences I had, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think people are looking for that. We're looking for vulnerability in our role models. And we're brought up in a culture where our role models were invulnerable and they were put on a pedestal. Yes. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think that the media is behind the times. You look at the television shows that are there to supposedly show us what business is about, and I can't even watch them now. But The Apprentice and Dragon's Den, the image of the Alan Sugar in his ivory tower telling everyone they're rubbish. I think that's an appalling message to send people. The vulnerable leadership talk I mentioned, one of my core messages is step off the pedestal, lead from among and not lead from above. And that translates into coaching as well. I want to pick up on something else that you said, if I can, and that's, you mentioned trust, which we haven't really explored. But let's take two things together. You mentioned trust, and you mentioned earlier about coming into work with a different mascot. How can you trust someone if you think that there is a different person lying underneath the person in front of you? You just can't.
I don't think you can.
A mask is a barrier to trust.
Absolutely. I think that's a brilliant soundbite from this podcast, in terms of, you're absolutely right. It's a mask is a barrier to trust. And everything we talk about is about how we build trust, which then builds performance of a business, because you've got more engaged, teams, better leaders and manager. The whole thing is just a win-win all round. I frequently get on my little soapbox saying there is just no downsides to building a coaching culture, but a coaching culture is absolutely steeped in the power of relationships at work.
Completely.
And being your true self, and actually admitting when you're wrong, asking for help. I always say the best people ask for help. Yeah. They absolutely ask for help. It's interesting. So in terms of the current world, and if there's one thing that kind of slightly winds me up on LinkedIn at the moment, is asking whether we all still prefer working in the office or at home or hybridly. That question's happening every day. It's like, no, stop. We're just doing it now, whichever we've moved. But anyway, people still want to ask everybody's preference. It is interesting. Relationships are different now over, like we're doing now, over Zoom or Teams, or how do you see that working out? Because that level of vulnerability with a screen in between you does feel, because I often get the sense of true authenticity through body language.
Yeah.
Through that feeling you have. It's a feeling, isn't it?
Completely. I'm laughing because the last podcast I was interviewed for was a live panel discussion on working from home, the future of work.
No, don't invite me onto that panel.
I think there's a couple of things there. Can you build relationships over Zoom and Teams and so forth? Yes, you can. I have my next book I'm writing with someone I get on incredibly well with. We've built a very strong collaborative relationship, and we've never met in person. She's in New York, and she's made some very powerful introductions for me. Hopefully I have done for her as well.
Yeah.
And she's been a regular guest on my podcast, and now we're going to be writing a book together. So it is possible. Is it easy? No. And here's an example. So I am dividing my time on this conversation by looking at my camera, which I'm doing at the moment. Obviously, people listening can't see that. but you will be feeling the eye contact and
Yes.
looking at my screen so I can see you and listen to you, which gives me more connection, but I now look distracted to you. And actually, even while I'm doing that, I want to be looking back at the camera because it feels so unnatural. So most people don't know those things. I mean, I think they're more aware than certainly at the start of the pandemic, because people like me have been saying, look at the bloody camera.
Totally.
But I think, I still see so many people who have their camera in a completely different place to their screen, and you're looking at the side of their face while they're talking to you. And that's a barrier to building relationships. But then there's the body language. Then there's the whether there's tension or relaxed. I think people are more transactional when they're on a Teams call or a Zoom call, and certainly that's played out in workshops I've run where I've had polls on, I was doing this more towards the start of the initial lockdowns, where I was asking, are you having more transactional conversations or more relational conversations than before? And apart from one group, it was all an increase in transactional. So we don't have that small talk when we wait for a waiter or waitress to come and ask what we want to order. We don't have that downtime when you're walking from reception to the meeting room and they ask, do you want a coffee or a water? All of those spaces created an opportunity for small talk, and that creates an opportunity for rapport building and getting to know each other. Now we're more agenda driven. I was asked in my presentation yesterday by someone who's gone part-time, and most of her meetings are by phone or virtual now in one form or another. How does she build those relationships? And I said, one of those things is to be conscious about small talk. Actually build it in. Don't go straight into the agenda when you're on that call, and mix things up. If everything's on Teams and Zoom, make some phone calls. And when you're on the phone, stand up and walk around, because you'll relax. You'll be more yourself. But then don't make everything a phone call. See the other person, but remember that thing about eye contact. So yes, you're absolutely right. I think that meeting in person, and particularly in a less formal setting, I gave two examples there, the formal meeting room and the informal bar or cafe or something. I think that the less formal settings create more of a space perhaps for vulnerability and opening up. It does come down to asking the right questions as well, and that human relationship and that careful listening. And I do think it's harder to listen effectively on Zoom or Teams. But having said that, many coaches have been working virtually well before the pandemic. And they don't have a problem. So I think you can train yourself to listen and focus. I always thought I couldn't do it, but most of my mentoring is virtual now. And I always swore I wouldn't do it because I thought I was always too distracted. And you know what? I'm not, because I focus on being in the room for the other person.
Being present and getting rid of other distraction. And you can tell when people are distracted. I think one of my funniest moments recently over a Zoom call was we were recording it, and so we were very smart from here up. So we were very smart, but we decided to both, it was a really hot day, we both decided to stand up and show each other that actually while we were smart here, we actually had shorts and slippers on. And that just sent us into like fits of laughter. The whole wardrobe has changed, I think, working from home, and in a good way. But coming back to the office sometimes is always hard, not being able to just rock up in a smart top and scruffy shorts. So if you were sharing... Go on.
Sorry. So just on that, that's really interesting as well, because I think our dress standards, and I use the term in a non-judgmental way, our dress code, our dress standard has relaxed. I'm wearing t-shirt and shorts and, thongs today. It's 30 odd degrees and my office gets really hot, and I have client calls. I think at the beginning of lockdown, I would have put a shirt on for them, or a polo shirt, but actually most of my calls, people are wearing t-shirts. I still wear a shirt to present, or polo shirt sometimes, or a polo shirt for mentoring. But then I will be shorts today. There's no doubt. Below that,
there is absolutely no way.
But it's actually carried on, I think, to a degree into face-to-face. So my first 2 or 3 presentations in person after the last bout of lockdowns, I couldn't do my trousers up. I slipped a disc during lockdown, and then I injured it again. So I wasn't able to exercise, and I'd put on weight, and I couldn't do my trousers up. So actually, I had to panic, I got some. Luckily, I was able to buy some smart trousers that fit me, and I delivered talks in shirt and trousers rather than a suit, which I wouldn't have done before the pandemic, and it was fine. And that's what I'm wearing now. And in fact, I was speaking at a conference in Portugal, and when I got there, my client asked me if I would help with a session the following morning, and he knew I was staying over for a few days, but I hadn't packed an extra shirt, which normally I would. And I said, I'll have to be in a polo shirt. Is that okay? And it was fine, and everyone was. And I think that our expectations have shifted in dress code, and that allows us to be more ourselves. And here's another, on this point of authenticity and vulnerability, I was delivering a session last year for managing partners and very, very, very senior executives in top professional services firms remotely during a lockdown.
Yep.
And I got onto the call before it started, and my client asked me to lose the green screen I had behind me with a very professional background created for it with my branding and just a simple plain background, because people wanted to see into other people's lives. They wanted to, not in a nosy way, but they just liked the connection of seeing actually that's their home. And one of the professional services firms I've worked with in the past is Grant Thornton. And one of the partners there told me that David Dunkley, the managing partner, was giving town halls, they call them, whole company meetings.
Town halls, chatting,
over Teams from his second bedroom. And that makes such a huge impact on the team there. So I think that authenticity that we lack when we turn up in a suit and tie, or not that I've worn a tie for years, but a suit in a formal office. I think that maybe remote connection has given us something back to counterbalance to a degree what we've lost by not meeting in person.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. We do a conference every year, and we talk. Last year, I put a picture on the screen of slippers. I was like, who's done their work this year in slippers, and like literally everybody had their hands up. So I totally get it. And in terms of advice to people or organisations on building a culture where, so this isn't just about one or two people being slightly vulnerable and others not. How do you really create that ripple effect of more and more people in an organisation opening up to this style of leadership, and not just leadership, being human at work? How do you get that culture going?
I think you have to start. Well, it's always difficult saying you have to start at the top, because actually, yes, the leaders in the organisation, it really helps if they portray the behaviour you want to encourage. In fact, I mentioned Grant Thornton, one of their senior partners, Perry Burton. He was at Lehman Brothers when the collapse happened, and he had mental health issues, and he blogged about it on their intranet, and he's very public on this, why I can share it. He's been a guest on my podcast. And by Perry opening up about his journey, and he's a massive mental health champion within GT, it has had a big impact on the culture within Grant Thornton about people understanding. And that's a culture where people work very long hours under a lot of pressure, but the mental health culture in terms of vulnerability is very strong there, and it comes from leadership, from Perry sharing his experience. But I think that can get held up if the middle management layers don't also buy into it. So you've got to lead from senior management, but bring the direct management along with you, the line managers, and create that space. A lot of organizations, HSBC is one that springs to mind, will have mental health champions among their staff, and they'll wear wristbands so people can identify them and know that there's someone they can talk to. I think that's a very worthy approach, and it's great to create that space. But a better culture is where people know exactly who to turn to within their team, and the trusted relationships there are there that allow it, and where they can be objective. Their line managers are people they trust. So I think you have to look out for areas where people are vulnerable and suffer because of it, whether it's from any form of bullying, even nuance that people don't even realise they're bullying. You know, I'm someone who, you know, I'm someone I was always brought up taking the mickey out of people and having the mickey taken out of me, and that's the environment. My dad was like that. I go to football and there's a lot of banter, as it's called, amongst friends, but I think there are lines and you have to be aware of it. And I've got a good friend now, and that's always been our relationship, but I know he's been through a hard time. So I always put a break on myself. And actually, when I see him next week, my plan is to say to him, I know I take the mickey a lot, but I'm proud of what you're doing, because he's been on a journey.
Yeah.
And I know he knows it comes from the right place. And I've always been there for him in that tough journey, which when other people haven't necessarily. But I still think it's important for me to know where the line is and to check where he is and check in. So I think, you know, it's not all about saying you can no longer have banter, you can no longer take the mickey, but it's about knowing where that line is when it turns into bullying, and being very aware of it and stopping well before that line.
Yeah. And I think you just said the words there. So next week when you meet your friend, you're going to meet him where he's at. So kind of go there to understand, you know, if he's in a great place and he can accept what, you know, banter or fun, great. But if he's not, then you meet them there. So that's really interesting. It's fascinating. It's a fabulous topic. And it's one that I could probably hear you talk about all day, because I think, especially you interviewing so many people around the world and drawing this out of people sounds a really worthy pursuit for yourself, and a great purpose in life to kind of really bring this to the fore, and to get more and more people, whether it's in their personal lives or at work, actually being the true self and being vulnerable and being prepared to ask other people for help. I found your 3 reasons why we don't really interesting, and we've got to change that. We've got to, I feel like I've got to be proud to say, look, the best people ask for help. Wow. Okay. I want to be one of those then, as opposed to, you know, the weakest people ask for help. No, let's get more people asking for help. And Andy, today, is there anything else that you would find really helpful to share with our listeners on, you know, on the power of vulnerability and the power of building brilliant relationships? Ideally, obviously at work and at home, they all kind of blur into one. But, you know, anything else you'd want to share today for our listeners? Because obviously we're all about creating a culture where people can bring their best selves to work.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Someone who teaches professional relationships, and vulnerability is only one area of it. A lot of my work is much more strategic relationship building to help you achieve certain objectives. It's very, you know, I talked about crossing lines a moment ago. There's another line that we've got to be very careful of, and that's where we turn from someone who authentically builds strong relationships and is comfortable asking for the help that they need, to someone who's seen as using others and manipulating. We've got to be very careful about that. Ooh. So I think what I would bear is it is okay to be strategic. It is okay to work out who you need to build relationships with and invest time in them, because that's why you're doing it. It's not to make friends. It's lovely when that happens, if that's appropriate in your role. And it's not always. But that's not the goal, and it is work or business, you know, your career focus. So it is okay, but it's not okay to make someone feel networked. And it's not okay to keep score. And the mentality you need is an abundant mentality. I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be familiar with Stephen Covey's 7 Habits.
Yeah, definitely.
And his concept of emotional bank accounts, where Covey says, you know, you wouldn't walk into a bank and seek to withdraw money if you haven't paid someone in the first place, and relationships are the same. Well, you wouldn't walk into a bank and pay in a £10 note and then go back in the next day and withdraw exactly the same £10 note. It would probably be a different note. And similarly, look at your network as that bank of professional relationships. And you may pay in one direction, but withdraw from another. But as long as you've got that mentality of helping people whenever you can without seeking anything in return, then it will work for you. My favourite quote is from Elizabeth Asquith Babesco, and she was the daughter of Lord Asquith, the Prime Minister when we went into the First World War. And she was a poet and an author, and she said, "Blessed are they who give without remembering and receive without forgetting." And I think that is so powerful. Give without remembering, receive without forgetting. That was in the talk as well.
It was in the talk, and I remember. That's just made me go all goosepimply. Yeah, exactly. That's made me that I have this goosebumpometer that gets set off in my podcast, and that's just set it off. Bang! That was amazing. Oh, what a fabulous way to end our podcast. That is such a powerful thing to live your life by, actually, and how to be not just at work but in life. So that's brilliant. Andy, thank you so much. I genuinely could listen to you all day talking about this such hugely important topic. I'd love to be able to come and see you on one of these talks around the globe, quite fancy a bit of traveling. But yeah, thank you. How are people best to get in contact with yourself? I know you've got your own podcast.
Yeah,
Connected
I do.
Leadership.
So the podcast is the Connected Leadership podcast. It's on all the channels. The beauty of having a name like mine is that if you can spell it, you can find me. And I know that will be in the show notes and the title of the show. But I've got a Linktree page which aggregates the key links, like my website, Psychology Today blog, the podcast, and books and so on. And that's Linktree. It's linktr.ee/Andy Lopata.
Yeah, wonderful. Andy, thank you so much for your time today. You've been an absolute superstar. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jo.
Thanks, Andy. And thank you again for everybody for listening to our Coaching Culture podcast. If you'd like to listen to more great guests, please do tune in to us again. Thank you.